In a distant corner of the galaxy, the Xilian species, once known for their peaceful nature and unparalleled artistic abilities, faced near extinction. Their world, once a haven of beauty and creativity, was ravaged by a ruthless empire that saw no value in their gentle ways. The Xilians were a species that thrived on harmony, their society built around art, music, and the deep connection they felt with the universe. But in a galaxy dominated by power and war, their peaceful existence was their undoing. The Empire's forces descended upon them without warning, decimating their population and leaving their world in ruins. Among the few who managed to survive was a young Xilian girl named Kayla. Barely old enough to understand the devastation around her, she was forced to flee, her heart heavy with the loss of her family and her people. Kayla was small, her delicate frame a stark contrast to the harsh reality she now faced. Her once vibrant eyes, filled with the curiosity of youth, were now shadowed by fear and desperation. Alone in a galaxy that had no place for her, Kayla wandered from one war-torn planet to another, scavenging for scraps of food, hiding in the shadows, and evading the ever-present dangers that lurked in the dark corners of these desolate worlds. She had become a ghost, slipping through the cracks of a universe that had forgotten her kind. The nights were the hardest, the cold seeping into her bones as she curled up in whatever shelter she could find, her stomach gnawing with hunger. Days turned into weeks, and Kayla's small body grew weaker with each passing moment. The vibrant colors of her Xilian skin, once a beautiful mosaic of blues and purples, began to dull. Her hands, once skilled in creating art that could bring tears to the eyes of those who beheld it, now trembled with exhaustion. Every step she took was a battle against the urge to simply give up, to let the darkness take her as it had taken so many of her kind. In her desperate search for survival, Kayla stumbled upon a derelict ship, abandoned in the chaos of war. Its once gleaming hull was now scarred and battered, a relic of a time when it had served a purpose. To Kayla, it was a lifeline. She crawled inside, her small frame allowing her to slip through a crack in the hull. Inside, the air was stale, but it was shelter, and for the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope. She scavenged what little she could find, moldy rations, stale water, but it was enough to sustain her for a while. As the days passed, Kayla's strength began to return, if only slightly. She explored the ship's interior, her hands running over the cold metal walls, her mind imagining the lives that had once filled this space. She found a small corner, hidden away from the world, where she could rest, her body curled into a ball as she drifted into a fitful sleep. But peace was fleeting, and Kayla knew she couldn't stay here forever. The ship was a temporary refuge, nothing more. One day, as she lay in her small corner, the ship shuddered violently. Kayla's eyes flew open, her heart pounding in her chest. The ship was moving, its engines roaring to life. She scrambled to her feet, panic flooding her mind. She had no idea where the ship was going or who had activated it, but she knew she had no choice but to stay hidden. The ship's movements were erratic, as if it was being pulled by forces beyond its control. Kayla clung to the walls, her fear growing with each passing moment. Suddenly, the ship's engines sputtered, and the vessel began to plummet. Kayla was thrown to the floor, her body tumbling through the narrow corridors as the ship descended. The sound of metal grinding against metal filled the air, and Kayla's heart raced as she realized the ship was about to crash. She braced herself, her small body curling into a tight ball as the ship hurtled toward an unknown destination. With a deafening crash, the ship struck the ground, the impact jarring every bone in Kayla's body. She lay still for a moment, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Slowly, she pushed herself up, her limbs trembling as she looked around. The ship was in ruins, its hull torn open by the force of the crash. Smoke filled the air, and the acrid scent of burning metal stung her nose. Kayla staggered to her feet, her legs barely holding her weight. She made her way to the nearest opening, her movements slow and deliberate as she navigated the wreckage. When she finally emerged from the ship, she found herself on a strange, desolate world. The landscape was barren, the sky a dull gray, and the air was thick with the scent of dust and decay. But there was something else, a faint glimmer of hope that she couldn't quite place. In the distance, Kayla saw what appeared to be a small settlement, its buildings huddled together, as if seeking refuge from the harsh environment. She hesitated, her instincts telling her to stay hidden, but the gnawing hunger in her stomach pushed her forward. She took a step, then another, her heart pounding in her chest as she made her way toward the unknown. Jonathan Reed lived a quiet, solitary life on the edge of the colony. His small home, nestled against the rugged landscape, was a reflection of the man himself, sturdy, weathered, and bearing the marks of a life lived in service to others. Jonathan had once been a soldier, a man of action and duty, but those days were long behind him. Now, in the twilight of his years, he found solace in the simplicity of his routine, though the echoes of the past never truly left him. The colony was a place of refuge for those like Jonathan, individuals who had given their best years to the galaxy and now sought a measure of peace. But peace was a difficult thing for Jonathan. The battles he had fought were far away in both time and space, yet their impact lingered, a constant presence in his mind. He had seen too much, lost too many, and the weight of those memories had driven him into a life of seclusion. The laughter of his comrades, the cries of the fallen, the chaos of war, they haunted him in the quiet hours of the night, refusing to fade with time. Jonathan had no family left. The war had taken them too, leaving him with nothing but the ghosts of what once was. He kept to himself, tending to his small garden, fixing the occasional broken machine, and maintaining a semblance of order in a world that had been anything but kind. The other colonists respected his solitude, understanding that some wounds never fully heal, even as they admired the quiet strength that he carried with him. One day, as Jonathan was walking along the outskirts of the colony, he noticed something unusual in the distance. Smoke curled up from the horizon, thin and gray against the sky. His instincts, honed from years of battle, told him something was amiss. He followed the trail, his heart heavy with a mixture of dread and curiosity, until he came upon the wreckage of a ship, its hull twisted and broken, half buried in the earth. As he approached, Jonathan's sharp eyes caught movement within the wreckage. He moved closer, cautiously, and saw her, a small, trembling figure huddled among the debris. She was an alien, that much was clear, but she was also just a child, her body gaunt and her eyes wide with fear. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, both frozen in place. Jonathan could see the terror in her eyes, the way her body tensed as if ready to flee at any moment. His first thought was of how vulnerable she looked, and something in him stirred, a deep, paternal instinct that he had long thought buried. He took a step forward slowly, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "It's okay," he said, his voice gentle but firm, though he knew she wouldn't understand the words. "I'm not going to hurt you." The girl flinched, her eyes darting around as if searching for an escape, but her frail body barely had the strength to stand. Jonathan's heart ached at the sight. He couldn't imagine what horrors she had witnessed to leave her in such a state. Without thinking, he reached into his pack and pulled out a small piece of bread, holding it out to her. "Here, take this. You must be starving." For a moment she didn't move, her eyes flickering between Jonathan and the bread. Then, slowly, she reached out with a trembling hand and took it, her fingers brushing against his. She snatched the food close to her chest, her eyes never leaving his, as if expecting some sort of trick. But when nothing happened, she cautiously began to eat, her movements quick and desperate. Jonathan watched her with a mixture of sorrow and relief. He could see the desperation in her every action, the way she devoured the bread as if it might be the last meal she'd ever have. And as he watched, something shifted in him. This girl, this frightened, starving creature, had stirred something in his heart that he hadn't felt in years. A sense of responsibility, a desire to protect, to help her in whatever way he could. After she had eaten, Jonathan spoke again, his voice soft and reassuring. "There's more food at my home," he said, gesturing back toward the colony. "It's safe there. You can rest." She didn't respond, but her eyes softened slightly, and Jonathan could see that she was considering his offer. He took a step back, giving her space, and waited. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the girl nodded, a small, hesitant movement. Jonathan smiled, the first genuine smile he had felt in a long time. "Come on, then," he said, turning and leading the way back to his home, glancing back occasionally to make sure she was following. As they walked, Jonathan couldn't help but think of how much had changed in the span of a few minutes. He had started the day alone, as always, but now, against all odds, he had found something, or rather someone, that gave him a sense of purpose again. It wasn't a grand purpose, nothing like the missions he had undertaken in his younger years, but it was something that mattered, something real. The girl remained wary, her eyes darting around as they walked, but Jonathan didn't push her. He knew that trust was something that had to be earned, especially for someone who had seen the worst of the galaxy. But as they reached his small, weathered home, he couldn't help but feel that this was the start of something new, something that might finally bring a measure of peace to both their lives. Inside, he offered her more food and a place to rest, watching as she slowly began to relax, her guard lowering just a little. Jonathan could see the pain and fear that still lingered in her eyes, but he also saw a glimmer of hope, a tiny spark that he was determined to nurture. And in that moment, as he watched her drift into a fitful sleep, Jonathan knew that he had made the right choice. This small, frightened girl had brought something back into his life that he thought he had lost forever. And as he sat quietly beside her, keeping watch as she slept, he felt a sense of calm settle over him, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, they could find some measure of healing together. Kayla's new life in Jonathan's home began slowly, with each day bringing small but significant changes. The house was simple, filled with the warmth of a life well lived, yet unfamiliar to her alien senses. At first, everything felt strange, the scents, the sounds, the very air seemed foreign. She moved cautiously, her steps light as if she feared disturbing the peace that surrounded her. The language, too, was a barrier, with Jonathan's words sounding like an intricate melody she couldn't quite follow. But Jonathan was patient, never rushing her, always speaking with a kindness that eased her fears. He began teaching her the basics, starting with simple words, pointing to objects, and repeating their names until she started to understand. At first, her responses were hesitant, her voice barely more than a whisper. But as days turned into weeks, her confidence grew. She began to mimic the words, her pronunciation improving, though her accent carried the soft, lilting tones of her native language. Jonathan would smile at her progress, a warmth in his eyes that she hadn't seen in anyone before. It was a slow process, but every new word she learned felt like a small victory, a step toward belonging. Life with Jonathan was different from anything Kayla had known. The routines of human life were unlike those of her people, yet there was something comforting in their predictability. Jonathan's day began with the sun, his movements purposeful but unhurried. He showed her how to make the simple meals that sustained them, his hands guiding hers as she learned to chop vegetables, stir pots, and bake bread. The kitchen became a place of quiet connection, where the shared act of preparing food bridged the gap between their worlds. Each meal they ate together, with Kayla gradually savoring the strange but delicious flavors, brought them closer. The garden was another place where they bonded. Jonathan's small plot of land was his pride, a piece of earth he had cultivated with care. He taught Kayla how to plant seeds, tend to the growing plants, and harvest the fruits of their labor. At first, her hands were clumsy, unused to the tools he handed her, but she quickly adapted, her natural grace shining through. As they worked side by side, Jonathan would talk stories of his past, the battles he had fought, the friends he had lost. He spoke of his family, his wife and children, whose absence still left an ache in his heart. Kayla listened, her silence a form of respect, her eyes reflecting the depth of his loss. In return, Kayla began to share fragments of her own story. Her words were still halting, but Jonathan understood the weight they carried. She spoke of her home, a world filled with colors and music that no longer existed. She described the beauty of her people, their art, their songs, all now lost to the void. As she spoke, her voice would falter, and Jonathan would gently place a hand on her shoulder, offering comfort without words. These moments of shared sorrow forged a bond between them, a connection that went beyond words or species. Kayla found herself growing more comfortable in Jonathan's presence, her initial wariness fading with each passing day. She no longer flinched at his touch, no longer hesitated to ask for help. Jonathan had become more than just a protector. He was a father figure, someone she could trust in a galaxy that had taken everything from her. She began to look forward to their evenings together, when they would sit by the fire, the warmth chasing away the cold that seemed to linger in her bones. They didn't always talk. Sometimes they just sat in silence, the quiet companionship enough to fill the space between them. But even in this growing sense of safety, there was an undercurrent of unease. Jonathan would sometimes glance out the window, his brow furrowed as if sensing something on the horizon. Kayla noticed the way he would check the locks on the doors, the way his hand would occasionally stray to the old weapon he kept hidden, a relic of his past. He didn't speak of his concerns, but Kayla could feel it, a tension in the air, a shadow that loomed just out of sight. She had lived with fear for so long that she recognized its presence, even when it was unspoken. Jonathan's cautiousness began to rub off on her. She found herself listening more intently to the sounds outside, her senses attuned to the slightest change. The peaceful life they were building felt fragile, as if one wrong move could shatter it. And in quiet moments, when Jonathan thought she wasn't looking, she saw the worry in his eyes, the way he seemed to carry an invisible burden. Kayla knew he was protecting her from something, but what it was, she could only guess. Despite the undercurrent of danger, their bond continued to deepen. Jonathan's kindness and Kayla's resilience formed a foundation of trust, something neither had known they needed so much. They became a family, two souls brought together by circumstance, finding in each other a reason to keep going. Jonathan had found a purpose again, and Kayla had found a home. Yet, in the back of their minds, both knew that this fragile peace could not last forever. Something was coming, something that would test the strength of the bond they had forged, and neither of them could ignore the signs any longer. The tranquility of the colony shattered when the Empire's soldiers descended without warning. They came in sleek, ominous ships, cutting through the sky like dark arrows aimed at the heart of the peaceful settlement. The colonists, mostly old and weary from a lifetime of struggle, had long since forgotten the sound of war. But the arrival of the Empire's forces stirred a primal fear in their hearts, a dread that had been buried deep beneath years of quiet living. The soldiers moved with cold precision, their orders clear: find and eliminate any surviving members of the Zillian race. They had come to erase the last traces of their ruthless genocide, to finish what they had started years ago. They were relentless, methodical, and utterly devoid of mercy. Their search began in earnest, combing through the colony with a brutal efficiency that left no stone unturned. Word spread quickly among the colonists. Whispers of fear and uncertainty echoed through the streets as the old men and women realized the danger that had come to their doorstep. They had lived in peace for so long, sheltered from the horrors of the galaxy, but now that peace was crumbling. The soldiers' presence was a stark reminder that the past could never truly be escaped, that the shadows of old wars still lingered, ready to strike when least expected. Jonathan felt the shift in the air before he saw the soldiers. His instincts, honed by years of combat, told him something was wrong. He moved quickly, his mind sharp despite his age, and found Kayla hiding in the corner of their small home, her eyes wide with terror. She had sensed the danger too, her body trembling with the memory of what the Empire had done to her people. Jonathan knew that fear well, but he also knew how to channel it, how to turn it into something that could be used to survive. Without a word, he gathered what little supplies they could carry. His movements were swift, deliberate, as he prepared for the inevitable confrontation. Kayla watched him with a mix of confusion and fear, her trust in him warring with the terror that had taken hold of her heart. Jonathan looked at her, his gaze steady, and something in his eyes told her that he would not let anything happen to her. Not while he still had breath in his body. The soldiers reached their home just as Jonathan finished his preparations. He could see them through the window, their dark uniforms stark against the bright landscape of the colony. There was no time to flee, no place to hide. They were coming for Kayla, and Jonathan knew they would not stop until they had her. But he had faced worse odds before, and he was not about to give up now. With a calmness that belied the storm raging inside him, Jonathan took up his old rifle, a relic from his days as a soldier. It had been years since he had held it, but the weight in his hands felt familiar, comforting even. He checked the weapon, his movements sure and practiced, and then turned to Kayla. "Stay close," he said, his voice low but firm. She nodded, her fear tempered by the strength she saw in him. The soldiers breached the door, their weapons drawn, but Jonathan was ready. He moved with the fluidity of a man half his age, his years of experience guiding his every action. The first soldier fell before he even realized what had happened, and the others quickly found themselves outmatched by the cunning of the old man. Jonathan's knowledge of guerrilla warfare, tactics that had once made him a legend among his peers, came rushing back. He led the soldiers on a deadly chase through his home, using every advantage he could find. But the battle was far from one-sided. The soldiers were well trained, their numbers overwhelming, and Jonathan's age was not without its limits. He fought fiercely, protecting Kayla with every ounce of strength he had, but the toll on his body was undeniable. In the heat of the fight, as he took down yet another enemy, a sharp pain shot through his side. He stumbled, his vision blurring as he realized he had been struck. Blood seeped from the wound, staining his clothes, but he gritted his teeth and pressed on, refusing to give in. Kayla saw the injury, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched Jonathan falter. Panic surged through her, but so did a fierce determination. Everything Jonathan had taught her, every lesson in survival, every word of advice, came flooding back. She couldn't let him fall, not like this. Summoning every bit of courage she had, she took up a weapon from one of the fallen soldiers and positioned herself between Jonathan and the advancing enemy. The soldiers, momentarily taken aback by the sight of the small alien girl standing her ground, hesitated just long enough for Kayla to act. She fired, her aim true, and the soldier in front of her dropped. The others regrouped, but Kayla didn't flinch. She remembered Jonathan's lessons, remembered how to use her size and agility to her advantage. She moved swiftly, her actions a blur of speed and precision, buying them the precious seconds they needed. Jonathan, wounded but not beaten, fought alongside her. They were an unlikely pair, a seasoned warrior and a young alien girl, but together they were formidable. The soldiers soon realized they had underestimated their opponents, and one by one they fell, unable to match the ferocity of a man protecting his home and a girl fighting for her life. But the victory came at a cost. As the last soldier hit the ground, Jonathan collapsed, the pain of his injury finally overwhelming him. Kayla rushed to his side, her hands trembling as she tried to stop the bleeding. Jonathan looked up at her, his vision fading, but in his eyes was a deep, unspoken pride. He had protected her, just as he had promised, but he knew his time was running out. Kayla, her heart breaking, realized that the man who had saved her might not survive, and for the first time, she truly understood the weight of what he had done for her. The dust settled in the aftermath of the battle, but the silence that followed was heavy with a sorrow that Kayla had never known. She knelt beside Jonathan, her small hands trembling as she tried to stem the flow of blood from his wound. His breathing was labored, each breath a struggle, and she could see the pain etched into his features. But it was his eyes that held her attention, the light within them dimming as he gazed up at her with a mixture of pride and regret. Kayla's heart ached as she realized the severity of his injuries. She had seen death before, had watched it take those she loved, but this felt different. This was the man who had given her hope, who had fought to protect her when no one else would. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back, knowing that he needed her to be strong. She took his hand in hers, holding on as if she could somehow keep him with her through sheer willpower alone. Jonathan's voice was a faint whisper, but the words carried the weight of a lifetime. "I'm sorry," he said, his tone heavy with the regret of a man who had lived with too many ghosts. "I wasn't there for my family. I couldn't save them." His eyes searched hers, as if seeking some form of absolution. "But I'm glad I could be here for you." Kayla squeezed his hand, her own voice breaking as she spoke. "You saved me," she whispered, her words choked with emotion. You gave me a home, you gave me hope. She wanted to say more, to express the depth of her gratitude, but the words caught in her throat. All she could do was hold on to him, her tears finally spilling over as she watched the life slowly ebb from his body. Jonathan's grip tightened slightly, a final burst of strength, as he drew her closer. You're strong, Kayla, he murmured, his voice growing weaker. Stronger than you know. Don't let this world take that from you. Promise me, you'll keep fighting. Kayla nodded, unable to speak, her tears falling onto his weathered hand. He smiled, a faint but genuine expression that brought a warmth to his eyes. Good, he breathed, his voice barely audible now. This home, it's yours now. Take care of it, and take care of yourself. With that, his hand went slack in hers, and the light in his eyes faded. Kayla felt a wave of grief crash over her, a pain so deep it threatened to consume her. She bowed her head, her tears flowing freely as she mourned the loss of the only family she had left. But even in her sorrow, she could feel the weight of his last words, the responsibility he had entrusted to her. He had given her more than just a home, he had given her a purpose. When the other colonists arrived, they found her still sitting by Jonathan's side, her small frame trembling with the force of her grief. But there was a determination in her eyes, a resolve that had not been there before. Jonathan had left her a message for them, a final request that she be cared for, not as an outsider, but as one of their own. His words, written with a shaking hand, were a plea born of love and hope, a plea that the colony would not let his sacrifice be in vain. The colonists, many of whom had known Jonathan for years, were deeply moved by his final wish. They saw in Kayla the same spirit that had made Jonathan a hero in his younger years, and they knew that she was more than just a survivor. She was a symbol of the resilience and kindness that defined their small community. Slowly, gently, they gathered around her, offering words of comfort and support. They assured her that she would never be alone, that Jonathan's home would remain hers, and that she would be part of their family from that day forward. Kayla felt the warmth of their acceptance, a balm to her wounded heart. She had lost so much, but in this moment she gained something precious, a place where she belonged, a people who would care for her as one of their own. The grief she felt for Jonathan would never fully fade, but she knew that he had found peace in protecting her, and that thought gave her strength. As the days turned into weeks, Kayla settled into her new life in the colony. The people embraced her, teaching her more about their ways, and she, in turn, shared what she could of her own lost culture. Jonathan's home became a place of remembrance, not just for him, but for the Zillian people as well. The colonists helped her tend to the garden, where she planted flowers that reminded her of her home world, a living tribute to the past that would continue to bloom for years to come. In time, Kayla found a new sense of peace. She had honored Jonathan's memory by becoming a part of the community he had loved, and in doing so, she had ensured that the legacy of both the Zillian and human kindness would live on. The bond between her and the colony grew stronger with each passing day, a testament to the enduring power of compassion and the belief that even in the darkest of times, hope could be found. The story of Kayla and Jonathan became a cherished tale among the colonists, a reminder that no matter how different they were bound by the same desire for connection, for family, and for a future built on the foundations of love and sacrifice. And as Kayla stood in the garden, looking out at the horizon, she knew that she was not alone. She carried Jonathan's spirit with her, and in that she found the strength to keep moving forward, to keep fighting for the life he had given her.